Hi, welcome to Plan 133. Today's lecture, it's Arts Publica versus Public Art. So, Arts Publica versus Public Art. Well, what do these two terms mean? The first term, Arts Publica, the word publica in it is used to relate to the political concept of the commons. In the sense of coming into dialogue and communications, arts publica thus suggests an art of dialogue to create commonality between diverse positions and points. So it's perhaps less about common identity or creed. Furthermore, publica does not mean state-owned in the sense of public property. Rather, it is more concerned with how diverse urban, social, spatial practices can come together to form a common planetary scale struggle against certain types of land use operations that might have divested people from sort of housing and mental welfare. When we position this term, arts publica, sort of versus public art, it is meant to open up new dialogues about public art, such as, to whose interest is public art created? Who funds them? How will public art transform neighborhoods, communities, and possibly put people into sort of housing disadvantage? And from opening up these dialogues, how can ethics emerge? How can ethics emerge from the materiality of the city we engage with, and also the materiality of the dialogue itself? So we can start today's lecture with a question kind of to frame up the discussion. Philosopher Chantal Mouffe asked this question: can artistic practices still play a critical role in a society where the difference between art and advertising have become blurred, and where artists and cultural workers have become a necessary part of capitalist production? Now, Chantal Mouffe's question at first seems to elicit a no response, thus resigning to the fact that artistic practices are futile in the struggles against capitalist production. However, one can also answer yes to her question, in which case it is really up to us who answer yes to figure out how might artistic practices play a critical role. Now, Mouffe's question also can be mapped onto planning. Can planning practices still play a critical role in a society where the difference between planning and real estate have become blurred, and where planners and designers have become a necessary part of the production of higher land value? Having stated these kind of framing questions, I want to highlight a few conceptual tools that might help us begin this critical dialogue with public art to inject publica into public art. The first of these conceptual tools is the idea that ethics is something that's produced through practice and experimentations. Now, this approach to ethics is drawn from the philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who asked this question: what can a body do? Specifically, what can a body do when it comes into new compositions of other bodies, rather than sort of simply asking, what is this body or that body? Spinoza's line of thinking thus shifts away from identities to its production of new subjects, new kinds of spaces that might be resistive to privilege and hierarchical formations. The focus thus is on more on sort of capacities for transformation despite and against the intolerable. Second kind of concept we can sort of draw from, it's the idea that resistance can be a sort of a refusal of predetermined ideals. Refusing predetermined ideals is not aimlessness or formlessness. It is rather recognizing what is generated as ethical for a specific moment stays for that specific moment. So in this sense, form, be it a form of policy or policy form, building form, or form of action, really serves as a temporary springboard, striving to its new explorations that can counter this amorphous capital colonialist empire. Perhaps strategically and politically, resisting utopian forms is one way to avoid capitalist appropriation. Ultimately, it comes down to that adage, do not give capital something fixed that they can grab onto and sort of like manipulate you. Third concept, it's the idea that theory and practice are perhaps non-equivalent. And this is sort of an idea that's sort of a concept that sort of frames this entire lecture, perhaps. Um, in this, it is to break the assumption that a theory or a concept can be wholly representable or translated into a practice that culminates in perhaps a building, a policy, or even a code of behavior or conduct. However, when we say theory and practice are non-equivalent, this is not to dispense with theory itself or theoretical writing specifically. Rather, it might be to approach theory or theoretical writing as offering conceptual textual forces to empower practices rather than to say it will be represented by practice. It's a building material perhaps for practice rather than that which define practice. Now I'll explore these three concepts that were just mentioned in kind of two general parts of this lecture. First part of the lecture, I'll simply term it gritty urbanism, in which I'll explore how the planning profession's economization of dirt and grittiness via sort of state commission public art that's also like sort of wrapping in sponsorship from sort of private developers sort of is used to kind of generate or uplift land values. And to counter sort of this gritty urbanism, the sort of public art, we have arts publica to offer a kind of critical discourse to cut through public art. Explore how, even within a highly codified city, there is perhaps a possibility to affirm city life as transforming and still transformative. Here is where we can elaborate more on arts publica in relationship to the concept of commons. Part 1. Gritty urbanism. Mainstream planning's formalization of urban grit or grittiness often means turning this grittiness into sort of replicable typologies. Thus, you see things like the pop-up plaza, the pop-up shop, the pop-up food truck, street food, mural festivals such as the one that you see on the screen right now. And this involves sort of assigning very fixed values to certain kinds of urban typology. Really, it's a form, sort of a wider planning sort of version of sort of architectural determinism. And the Vancouver Mural Festival is an example of this formalization of grittiness. Now, there's nothing inherently kind of sinister, perhaps, about murals. Murals themselves do not codify city life. In fact, murals like sort of graffiti and tagging are often used by the indignant to exert their presence against dominant culture. Murals are, in fact, the spatial tools, one might say, that some activists would be using to sort of blemish the orderly city, to insert themselves against the order of the city. So perhaps we can say the issue is not the murals that are represented here in this picture themselves, but where these murals take place, who commissioned the murals, and the socio-economic, political, spatial, and ethical impacts that follow such a festival as Mural Festival. The mural's location ultimately affects spatial justice. Here's a map of Vancouver. In the green, it's East Vancouver. In the sort of pink dashed line is largely where the Vancouver Mural Festival occurs. So it really occurs kind of annually in East Vancouver, East Side Vancouver, particularly in the Mount Pleasant and Hastings kind of neighborhoods. A bit of background for those of you who are listening in from overseas. East Vancouver, East Side, is historically kind of lower income with a higher percentage of visible minorities and indigenous persons. It has also many kind of rundown industrial buildings that kind of provide affordable spaces for artists, musicians, and sort of blue collar kind of jobs like sort of car repair shops and stuff like that. And a lot of these kind of like industrial buildings with the high ceilings, open plan, and such are ripe for the real estate industry to reproduce a bit of Soho in Vancouver for the creative class. Florida's kind of creative class. So a lot of them are sort of transformed into lofts, artisanal bakeries, and open plan offices that will ultimately boost the properties like land values and thus corresponding taxes. From a conventional planning kind of perspective, increased taxes fill the public coffer with more, and thus prepares it better for sort of more amenities, which boosts investments into the neighborhood. The Vancouver Mural Fest curates what I call gritty urbanism that facilitates these kind of like land lifting, land value increase aspirations. At first glance, these colorful murals seems to challenge architectural modernism's preference for white walls and orderly spaces. For many architects and planners, when we make murals mainstream, that's a positive move in terms of that shift from sort of austere high modernism to kind of fun contemporary postmodernism. But gritty urbanism can also mute voices of dissent and actually displace people. Many of the more dire parts of East Vancouver, even if public amenities were boasted, spatial justice is still lacking, especially when existing low-cost housing are sort of diminished and replaced with these sort of lofts and Soho lofts and stuff like that. So when planners rejuvenate the urbanscape, whose voice is being silent? Who's divested from the territory? Who ends up with lesser power to act and to speak? These mural festivals neutralize the political power of street art. Rather than actually crafting new spaces to exercise freedom of movement, hence rights to the city, the depoliticized murals deterritorialize the walls that were formerly used as sites for resistance where the disenfranchised can exercise visual critique of the repressive regime, and then instead re-territorialize these walls into canvases to market the urban factor. Here, spatial re-territorialization is not liberative, but simply um, capital colonial structures modulating itself to strengthen its own capacity to act, while at the same time diminishing the ability of other bodies to act. Activating dead space by actually stifle public life by continuing the old regime's surveillance and exclusion. Thus, inclusion in this mural festival often means the art's content must add value to the new regime's economic growth projections. So ultimately, it's about, as you can see, putting dirt back in place. How does public art add value to this economic endeavor to put dirt back in an economic kind of place? To address this question, we can perhaps turn to sociologist Mary Douglas's work on dirt in the city. She noted dirt is often treated as matter out of place. But treating dirt as out of place does not always mean dirt is actually negated and thus left alone to flourish in its own dirtiness. In fact, acknowledging dirt out of place also means putting dirt back in place. This out of place category affirms hierarchies and binaries rather than actually breach these hierarchies and binaries. Jamie Pack, a geographer from UBC in Canada, problematizes the creative class and noted creative strategies often commodify the arts and cultural resources, even social tolerance itself, suturing them as putative economic assets to evolving regimes of economic competition, urban competition. Urban grittiness is repackaged to maximize its economic utility. Furthermore, gritty urbanism also captures radical energies and repackages them as edgy to preempt any meaningful social critique. The sociologist Frederick Vandenberg wrote, capitalism has progressively integrated the critique of capitalism itself into its own mode of functioning. Critique becomes marketing. And mainstream planning is complicit in this through its policy to sort of facilitate activities like that that will eventually lead to sort of land values being lifted and thus displacement of sort of vulnerable populations. Now, having said all that, I like to think not all is lost. And in the next section, I'd like to explore some conceptual tools to recompose this very codified urbanscape that is produced by sort of like gritty urbanism, Vancouver Mural Fest, and then look at how we can sort of bring forth a new kind of life that might be imminent in this kind of quote unquote dead kind of space. And so we move on to part two of the lecture, which is about Ars Publica. And I'll begin with this. Beginning with a quote by Michel Foucault, who talks about the idea of like recomposition. He says, power relations are mobile. Power relations, power structures that can be modified. Thus, for Foucault, freedom is produced through actions and interventions. Freedom is not given. Freedom does not already exist outside this space we inhabit, as if freedom was a sort of given space or entity that we can simply retreat to. Rather, freedom is created by specifically attending to the specific situation, recomposing that specific situation towards its own liberation. So if we take a cue from Foucault, if the real estate industry can turn sort of things like graffiti, street art into sort of economic generators, is it not possible to again recompose the relations between murals, back lanes, and property values into something that's more politically charged, thus to repoliticize mural festivals and street art? The strategy is to break the real estate industry's capture by means of constant reinvention against it. And breaking this also means we might have to break with mainstream land use planning logic of the adage of highest and best economic use. How do we modify power relations? To ground our resistance to gritty urbanism, this question of how to modify power relations can perhaps be expanded also to include what power relations created gritty urbanism's economic utility. And this question is somewhat sort of talked about in the previous section. And what relations can be recast to imbue murals with more political capacity and ultimately sort of capacity for expression outside of the ordained. While gritty urbanism may use the same spatial typologies, sort of murals, pop-up plazas, etc., and planning policies for example, like getting developers to build community gardens in exchange for more density, in all the cities that gritty urbanism might manifest in. How gritty urbanism adversely impacts minority bodies in the different places across the world kind of differ. Hence, how we intervene and recast the stagnant relations between always begin with site specificity. Insofar as the city itself is always changing, so does the interventions against gritty urbanism. It has to be particular to the site and also particular to the time itself, and particular to with whom we have allied with and who our adversaries are. For example, even within one city, how we counter sort of gritty urbanism might be quite different. Countering gritty urbanism in downtown Vancouver versus Chinatown might be different. The degree that sanctioned public art impacts and limits the capacity for different populations to act and speak differs between downtown Vancouver and Chinatown. The pretty murals leading to higher taxes and rent may force, for example, Chinese seniors and shopkeepers out of sort of low rent housing and shops. But on the other hand, the very pretty murals on the side of an office building might actually boost its Fortune 500 tenant sales and sort of make the building more marketable for more people to want to move in. And ultimately, one can also say, Vancouver's sort of take on gritty urbanism might be very different from Hong Kong's Sam Shui Po neighborhoods take on sort of gritty urbanism, where you get a lot of hipster cafes and stuff like that. So different strategies to counter different repressive spaces. Now, to counter gritty urbanism, it is also to be attentive to perhaps what feminist scholar Elizabeth Gross calls surpluses. These are surpluses that dominant culture cast out or cannot contain simply. They could be part of a lane that has not yet been turned into the curated street party, state-sanctioned murals that have been otherwise later vandalized by activists. In fact, insofar as a city cannot be fully determined by any entity, even capital colonialist structures, one might suggest that the city is always a bit more than itself. A city is a surplus of itself. And furthermore, Gross says, surpluses are not extraneous, but in fact integral to a city's form, its formation as well. Used strategically, surpluses can usurp orthodoxies and crack open the city's well-tempered strata to usher in kind of new voices. So consider this. What are the surplus at the site we're encountering? What forces can these site-specific surpluses lend us to create new capacity to act and to speak? How can planning, design, artistic practices connect surpluses from different sites across the city, across cities from different parts of the world to form a common struggle? Connecting surpluses from different sites will no doubt produce hybrids that cannot be predetermined in advance. Given this, it is impossible for theory to forecast what must or what will happen. Instead, it is necessary to practically work through the materiality of the values, forces, surpluses, and relations at play. Evaluate situational injustices and amplify voices and bodies needing amplification. Hence, what amounts to theoretical writing when we deal with things like surplus is this: theoretical writing cannot, as a matter of logic, totalize what precise procedure must occur, or how to precisely recompose the surpluses, bodies, and forces. Theory, however, must factor in its own multiplication. So, we might ask this question: what can theory do practically? Theoretical writing can perhaps be seen as a platform for experiments to spring forth. It may be to treat theory production as generating textual, conceptual forces to be taken up by artists, other planners, and other designers to bolster their own craft. It is never to have the hubris to say theory wholly determines outcomes. One has to rethink the convention of placing theory as anterior to what is commonly considered practice. Instead, one might consider theory as a constellation of texts, concepts, and diagrams to be used to draw up other constellation of texts, concepts, and diagrams. Theory is just a particular set of forces in the city, never separate from the city itself. Doesn't explain the city. But nonetheless, theory is a set of forces that can inspire dialogues. So one might imagine theory as this, and I'll give you a bit of an analogy. Think of theory like a hammer. A hammer has no equivalence to the table that it might produce. It offers a function, but this function is only expressible only when it's combined with a carpenter's knowledge, the carpenter's actual physical strength to drive the hammer, drive the nails and wood, the nails into the wood to create the table. In short, theory lends forces to practical matters, but theory does not have a physical equivalence in the design edifice, place, or even a policy. And producing theory that strategically refuse to prescribe ideal worlds is to give no forms that capital colonialist operations can appropriate. Theory production, design planning, and the construction labor are different modalities on the same plane of worlding. The philosopher Henri Lefebvre, who writes a lot about space, noted this unity amongst the different modes of theory or philosophy and sort of like creating worlds. He says, there is a simultaneous becoming philosophy of the world and a becoming world of philosophy. It is in the event of a city becoming philosophy and philosophy or theory becoming city, where the universal and the particular express on the same plane, and this is where ethical acts, speech, and ideas may emerge. And these ethical acts, speech, and ideas do not precede an engagement of the material of the city and its inhabitants. And the tools that one might use to evaluate the power structures at play are in fact to be developed in the event of the engagement with other strangers, allies, the material of the city. Likewise, the ethical positions to be developed are always within the city rather than existing before the city as codes. Ethics are thus not derived from preordained code of conduct or some form of like transcendental morality. There is instead a materially situated ethics. Practicing ethics may be to experimentally, but nonetheless also strategically intersect different trajectories to produce new connections and relations. However, it is also to recognize whenever an intersection is made, this does not equal uh, the formation of an ideal shared territory. Trajectories and struggles may intersect but remain separate and continue to form divergent territories. The material city, of course, comprises of different voices, values, and relations that may never synthesize into a happy middle. Maintaining strife between foes, strangers, and even allies can sometimes be strategic. And there might even be a more practical reason why sometimes maintaining strife and sort of spatial distinction even could be helpful. For example, sometimes increasing a disadvantaged group's capacity to act and its capacity to speak may require a distinct space rather than a shared space in order to allow them to have sort of more equitable spatial social representation. Simply sort of assuming a shared space is the ideal is to perhaps mistakenly assume all parties involved in this sort of discussion arrive at the table with equal powers of representations, equal powers to speak and act. In fact, we don't. We don't always arrive at the table with that sort of equal representation of power. Finally, maintaining strife does not mean that these distinct positions remain static via some form of cultural relativism. Maintaining strife does not have to begin with the assumption that one is indisputably correct. It is only a matter of desiring, even if strategically, a distinct space to speak from. So, despite not merging, transformation between sort of bodies that have intersected can still take place. It can perhaps be framed as opposing bodies that are evolving by themselves without actually convergence. They draw forces from each other and sort of transform without necessarily becoming sort of like a unified hybrid. Now, it is this image of opposing bodies without evolving without convergence, touch without convergence, perhaps we can think of it, that I'd like us to contemplate as we wrap up with a note on Ars Publica. Even when two or more parties may be struggling against the same pervasive capital colonialist operations in empire, it does not mean that they must merge necessarily. Um, I'll give you sort of a scenario, a hypothetical scenario. For example, a certain development company um, who's in sort of the fashion business, sports fashion business, have acquired a lot of industrial lands in one city for sort of redevelopment into sort of condos or whatever. And the acquisition of industrial lands might have resulted in sort of artists and blue collar workers um, given notice of rent increase, or simply or if they cannot pay the rent, they have to vacate the premise. Um, And what could happen is like, despite the different sort of socio-political allegiances, the blue-collar workers who might be sort of auto repair guys, uh, as well as the artists who like work in these industrial buildings, may stand in solidarity to protest against this spatial economic injustice. They might come together to form a common cause, banding together different languages, different codes, different political opinions, different political subjects and spaces to counter an intolerable situation. Additionally, one might also ask, um, what kinds of intersection can these artists, these blue collar workers, as well as like sort of, can they team up with other sort of bodies of people that might have been oppressed by the same sort of like a developer elsewhere in the city, elsewhere in the world, perhaps. There's common cause between sort of like the blue collar workers and the artists. The common cause is how I picture the Publica in Arts Publica. This Publica is a network space, a platform for emerging dialogue, subjects, and spaces, a space for the production of differences, even in strange but necessary solidarity. Specifically, I draw this notion of a common via difference from the philosophers Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's use of the term. They call and they say this: for Hart and Negri, the common does not refer to traditional notions of either the community or the sort of public in the sense of government public. It is based on the communications between singularities, single bodies, and emerges through collaborative social processes of production. So for the arts publica, one might say this common is a coming together of diverse, perhaps artists, and as well as planning spatial practices, potentially even globally, to form a sort of common struggle against a borderless capture of art production, borderless sort of transformation of sort of street art and street art festival into something that is simply used to sell real estate. The diverse struggles may land different sort of spatial, social, cultural, economic outcomes, but nonetheless they can intersect to lend direct and indirect forces for each other's struggle. They share information, whatever, and very often they can kind of organize without an explicit sort of leader or organizer or sort of figurehead or sort of even a single revolutionary sort of figure. And this self-emerging organization of power, the sharing of concepts and perhaps political tactics to empower different struggles across the world, is seen in this kind of multi-city, multi-nations, funeral marches for the climate that's been sort of uh, kind of organized by sort of the Extinction Rebellion movement. Taken together at a global scale, the funeral marches suggest a kind of arts publica emerging. They present a spatial aesthetic form of resistance which affects uh, at once, or that is at once kind of site specific. The affects are site specific and at once also global. The images of the marches as they proliferate on social media form a platform for dialogue, a publica. People may start to conduct their own action to jolt complacent attitudes to its climate issues. This publica or dialogue that extends beyond the climate funeral marches does not necessarily have to take the form of any specific kind of artwork, a medium, or genre. As mentioned earlier, it is a movement where intersecting practices constitute an evolving democratic commonwealth that is beyond the private realm and the state-owned public space. It is site-specific but beyond the mere category of property. Within a publica's conceptual and physical space, the ethical, and by extension I would say the ability to make democratic choices, the ethical is not derived from codes of good citizenry, good citizen conduct. Instead, the ethical moments emerges when the publica in its many permutations, its modes, intersect, intervene, resist, and destabilize a state-sanctioned public art that, like gritty urbanism is a form of, to produce a new kind of space and time, however minute that space and time might be, for the disadvantaged to gain more capacity to act. So in the case of like the funeral climate, the marches sort of like destabilizes sort of traffic flow, and in some sense might destabilize sort of the daily functions of sort of capitalist society, the work life. At this junction, one is reminded of Foucault's idea that liberation from the intolerable is produced rather than given. Liberation, it's a practice of forging increased capacities to act by recomposing the relations and the limits between collectives, individuals, physical and social spaces, and even political philosophical concepts. Through this lens of recomposition, the philosopher Gilles Deleuze suggested this about ethics. Being ethical perhaps is a question of knowing whether relations, and which ones, can compound directly to form a new, more extensive relation, and whether capacities can compound more directly to constitute a more intense capacity of power. Ethics framed by Joe Deleuze here, takes on a social relational form rather than a strictly legal one. Although this is not abandoning the legal frameworks altogether, um, one might say, working with planners, architects, and government agencies is still possible, especially if they are worthy adversaries. Rather than subsuming to mainstream planning's logic, this new relation requires experimenting with how legal planning frameworks, together with the values and evaluation systems non-planning individuals and collectives can bring, and can be recomposed to form the new common. It is to treat the state as material to be and ultimately re-territorialized for the production of new ethical moments, rather than to see the government planning agency as sole determinant for the city's future. Through the arts publica, it is possible to use the state against the state. Lastly, Deleuze also pointed out, more than just seeking how one might persevere by gaining more intense capacity to act, it is asking how in doing so those connected to one's endeavors also gain. This is where individuals and separate struggles join as a common body. So I'd like to end this lecture with a few discussion questions that we can sort of explore, I guess, together in the discussion section. Coming back to that sort of earlier question, how can artistic practices and planning practices sort of counter sort of capitalist, colonialist control of public art? And from these sort of questions, we might think of this, like what kind of platforms might be produced in the alliances between planning, perhaps unorthodox, unstately planning and artistic practices? How might joint planning artistic practices resist announcing the next platform? What kind of platform is needed to refuse form? In the interest of global arts publica, how can these practices connect across border? Thank you.